The chandelier shook, scattering shards of light across the courtroom. Ethan's hands trembled as he signed one word. Lies? A hush spread, heavy as a storm about to break. Across the aisle, Miriam stood, clutching a worn notebook, her face pale with fury. Everyone waited for someone to speak, but no one dared. And then, the first secret fell, louder than a verdict. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rain came down in slow sheets, soft as an apology and just as empty. Streetlights blurred into long gold threads on the wet pavement. Inside the restaurant, glass held the city like a photograph, sharp outside, softly out of focus in the warm light. The tables smelled of lemon oil and grilled rosemary. Voices were low, like people trying not to wake an old wound. There he was, at a small corner table by the window, Ethan Pierce. His suit fit like a memory, expensive, precise, but a little tired at the edges. He sat straight, hands folded on the table, as if they were the only steady thing left in the world. He did not raise his head often. When he did, his eyes gathered the room in quick, polite sweeps and let it go. There was a careful distance about him, the kind you build when you have learned how many hands reach for the things you own. If you watched Ethan long enough, you could see the quiet battle happening beneath his calm. He was known in the city for numbers and deals, for the clean architecture of his successes. The headlines called him a genius. His lawyers called him practical. But those facts were only the outer shell. Inside, he lived with a noise the world could not hear, the space where sound should be. He had been born without a voice that made sound. People around him called that muteness, but the truth was more complicated. He had a voice like any other, full of plans and anger and tenderness, but it lived in a silence no one learned how to translate. Tonight, he ate alone, not because he wanted to be lonely, but because the rituals kept him measured. Order, fork, knife, napkin, the geometry of controlled moments. A woman at the next table laughed, and it made a bright corner of the room blink. Ethan glanced away quickly, as if laughter might reach him and pull something loose. He drank water in small, precise sips and read the menu by the light from his phone. He listened with his eyes. The way a bartender wiped a glass, the tilt of a waiter's shoulder, the hush of a diner leaning into a story. These were his sounds. From a softer place, someone watched him. Not a person in the room, but the part of the narrator that wanted him to be understood. There is a hunger in seeing someone alone and wanting to stitch them back to the world. Ethan's isolation felt like a wound that had been kept clean, bandaged, and hidden. The observer's voice asked why a man with everything would sit so carefully apart. The answer was layered. Fear, habit, a name he kept crossing off in his head when the thought came, family. He had inherited the Pierce name like a coin that was never his to spend. His father had built an empire out of cold logic and colder choices. The company grew because some doors were closed on others, because deals were done in rooms where no one asked about the consequences. Ethan had learned how to run a machine that made fortunes and left people smaller. He had learned to sign contracts, to sign instructions, to sign the last goodbyes in meetings where the word sorry was stamped with a fine print. Tonight, the surface read as ordered. Under it, there was a current of restlessness. Ethan's eyes flicked to the door every few minutes. He did not know why he expected anyone, but his body still held the old habit of waiting. The city, the rain, the street lamps, they conspired to make waiting feel like a verb. Sometimes a man waits because he is hopeful. Sometimes because he is haunted. Ethan, who had been framed by other people's expectations for most of his life, could not always tell which he was. The impartial voice of the narrator might note that Ethan's wealth was not a simple shield. Money buys choices, and choices sharpen into walls. His silence made those walls taller because others did the talking for him. They said what was safe. They said what sounded like care. But words can hide more than they reveal. In the hush of the restaurant, one could see how others curated their interactions around him. Servers were different, speaking slower and softer, as if gentleness could be translated into actions alone. Investors sent messages in neat fonts. Friends, a small selection, carefully tested, sent photographs and short notes. Even affection came wrapped in contracts. A soft clatter at the bar made Ethan look over. A young couple argued quietly. A child dropped a spoon and shrieked, and the noise filled his chest like a remembered bell. He understood the math of loss better than he understood the math of gain. He had given up certain futures without fanfare. The idea of a household that smelled of bread and small socks, the possibility of a noisy kitchen. Those futures had been folded into other people's ledgers and signed away. He carried them like fossils, small, sharp, beautiful, and impossible to grow from. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and luminous. Inside, a woman in a black coat went to the restroom. A waiter passed with a tray of desserts like jewels. The restaurant hummed on. Ethan let his hands rest on the table and drew slow diagrams in his head, outlines of the next quarter, the next acquisition. The way to tighten an argument in a boardroom until no one could oppose it. He could plan his empire in stitches. But he could not plan the small things. The way a stranger's eyes would rest on him tonight. The way a single gesture could change the tack of a life. The empathetic voice remembered a time when Ethan had been less expert at building walls and more expert at feeling. Memory has a weight of its own. Once, before the company became a fortress, before deals turned into distance, there had been a child who learned language through touch and light. The child learned how to map the world on his palms. He learned to speak with his hands because speech refused him. The early people in his life taught him to hope that someone would respond in kind. That hope became a fragile anchor. It had slipped many times. He signed with sharp, practiced hands. Sign language was his writing and his private music. It was how he told those he trusted the small things, only they would understand. I am tired, do you remember? Forgive me. But as he grew, people listened less, or they listened only when it suited them. Corporations do not answer in fingers, they answer in files. Sentences were drafted and signed, not felt. The empathetic part of the narrator wanted the reader to know that Ethan's silence was not absence. It was an ongoing conversation, one that had often been answered with indifference. A bell at the door chimed. He looked up more quickly this time. The waiter glanced toward the entrance and then back to the kitchen. Nothing remarkable came in. A woman whose laughter had been bright left with her coat slung over her arm. The city kept its secrets and its small mercies. Ethan signed to himself, an old habit when decisions weighed him down, a brief, private phrasing that meant wait and hold. Hands can be a governor of impulse. He had taught himself how to pause. The impartial voice observed that this pause was also a pattern. Ethan had learned to make decisions slowly, to let people reveal their colors on the edges. His hesitance had been praised as prudence by some and criticized as coldness by others. But the truth was in his eyes when he was alone, a tired curiosity, like a man who had read one book too many and still hoped for a new page that would shift the whole story. Tonight, there was a folded envelope beside his water glass, the kind of envelope that carries complications. He had not opened it. He did not show surprise that it existed. Envelopes were part of the architecture of his life. The envelope had his name printed in a thin black font. No return address. The impartial narrator might record that such a thing would prompt questions at a less controlled table. At Ethan's table, it was another variable to log, another decision to defer. Rain slid down the glass, making bright streaks that blurred the city into watercolor. Inside, the light was warm and forgiving. Ethan put his hand on the envelope and felt the paper under his palm, cool and possible. He did not yet know a woman's hands would cross the room minutes later, or that a gesture he had longed for would be offered with no expectation in return. He did not know that the envelope could be the push he needed to fold a life into a new shape. A single word hangs in the air of the empathic voice, waiting. Not the bored waiting of a man with nothing left to do, but the waiting that contains a question. Tonight would be the kind of evening where a question finds an answer that was not on any spreadsheet. In the silence that was his world, something small and human had begun to tilt toward him. Unnoticed, yet inevitable, as if the rain had been gathering to practice falling right where it was meant to. The bell over the restaurant door gave one soft, ordinary ring, and then a different sound threaded the room, a pair of footsteps that did not hurry and did not hang back. Ethan looked up because small shifts pulled at him. He had been watching the rain for a long time, and now the air in the room felt wrong in the best possible way, as if something secret had arrived to correct a mistake. She came in with an easy calm. Her coat was plain, dark, the kind that keeps its own shape in a downpour. Her hair was pulled back in a low twist. She moved like someone used to finding ways through crowds without making noise. He noticed the color of her hands first, a deep warm brown that caught the light from the window and made the knuckles shine like little O's. She walked to the nearest empty table, paused, and looked at him for a half-second that was longer than social politeness required. Her eyes were very clear. For a breath, he felt, absurdly like she had read him from across the room and decided to stay. The empathetic voice leaned forward. There are moments in a life where two people meet a third time through a gesture. For Ethan, who lived by gestures in a world that valued spoken clauses, this single look was a kind of punctuation. The woman, he would learn her name soon, did not speak. She did not need to. She reached into her bag and took out a small notebook and a pen. For a second, he thought she would write to ask for a menu or a spare chair. Instead, she moved across the room with a quiet certainty and sat down at the table directly across from him, as if she had been invited. The impartial voice recorded the obvious. A stranger sitting opposite a billionaire is unusual. Dinner tables are ordered places. People do not intrude upon the solitary rituals of a wealthy man without purpose. Yet the woman had an air of belonging to another life, or perhaps to no life at all. She watched him with the same clarity, and when she finally raised her hands, the motion was deliberate, confident. She began to sign. Ethan felt the old surge of recognition hit him in the middle of his chest. Sign language is a language of muscle memory and eye contact. It demands a kind of intimacy that spoken words can avoid. He had not expected anyone to speak to him that way in a restaurant where servers translated with smiles and investors sent texts. He had not expected, certainly, the directness of this approach. She signed a simple phrase, Ethan Pierce. Her fingers were precise. They trembled only in the kind of way that comes from bravery. He answered in kind, because that was his automatic ground. The movement of his hands across the table was an apology and an invitation, bundled at once. Yes, he signed. The room, which had been a warm hum around the two of them, narrowed to a private channel. People moved like scenery while their hands spoke. She wrote a single line on the notebook and slid it across to him. The words were in neat block letters. My name is Grace. I need to tell you something. He felt his pulse mark the paper beneath his palms. He did not open the envelope beside his glass. He did not ask where she had come from. He only signed, You can speak with your hands. Grace's smile was small and quick, like a secret being allowed. She signed back not to the room, but directly to the place inside him that had been bandaged for years. I know you, she signed, or I knew someone who knew you. The sentence landed between them like a coin dropped on a table. It made a bright, brittle sound that could not be ignored. The empathetic voice noticed the sudden tilt in Ethan's breath. He had learned to expect people to know him by reputation, headlines, stock listings, philanthropy profiles, but this was different. It implied history. It implied memory. It invoked a triangle. Him, her, and another person whose name was not yet spoken. The narrative thread tightened. Grace's eyes flicked once to the envelope at Ethan's elbow and then away. The small motion was enough to set a question in his chest. Why had she come here tonight to him? She put down the pen, and with deliberate slowness, she signed a phrase that made Ethan's hands steady and cold at once. There is a letter. It belongs to your mother. The impartial voice recorded the practical impossibility. His mother had been gone for nearly a decade. Her death had been listed in polite pages and covered by quiet obituaries. To suggest a letter was to suggest continuity from a ghost, and ghosts are messy things in a life built on control. Ethan felt something inside him that had been folded away begin to unfold. His fingers moved to the envelope beside his water glass, and without thinking, he slid it toward Grace. Her eyes followed the paper like a pilgrim following a sign. She picked it up as if it were the exact thing she had been waiting for, smoothing the edge with the careful motion of someone who handles fragile histories. There was a man at the bar, a stockbroker type, who watched with a polite curiosity and then a slight shrug. He could not have known what the exchange meant. A server named Mark, who had been waiting on Ethan for months and had learned to read his hands from across the room, watched with something that might have been concerning or nothing at all. The room returned its normal noises because restaurants are made to return to themselves. But the two of them were a different, private weather system now. Grace uncapped her pen and wrote again, then signed while she wrote. I was told to find you. I refused. Now I am here because I have to tell you the truth about the work your company did in Lagos. About the child named Sarah. About the money that buried a secret. Ethan's hand tightened on the envelope. Sarah, the name was like a splinter he had not known was under his skin. He remembered a photograph, a file, a meeting blurred by lawyers and sanitized minutes. He had not allowed himself to think of the human shapes that were altered by his decisions. Memory is an uninvited guest. It finds the smallest opening and sets itself to stay. The impartial voice, this could be performance. People sometimes carried stories for leverage. They sometimes asked for money. They sometimes sought revenge. But Grace's face did not hold the tools of deception. Her expression carried a tiredness that matched the rain. When she signed, I am sorry, and then I cannot stay, it was a sentence that seemed too small and too large at once. She pushed the notebook and the envelope back to him and took a breath. They told me to come when you were alone, she signed. They told me you would be soft when you thought no one listened. The words had the stale shape of manipulation. The idea that grief could be timed and sent as a package was itself a cruelty. Ethan's mouth twitched in a way that was almost a smile and almost a warding off. There was a shadow at the edge of the bar, a man with a ring and a sharply tailored coat who lifted his glass and watched them with an interest that was not casual. The way he watched suggested plans. The empathetic voice found that detail and pressed it like a fingertip to the map of danger. Someone else knew they had met. Someone else may have arranged it. The idea that Grace might not be acting alone, that there might be a hand guiding her, made the air between Ethan's ribs hard. Grace signed one more phrase. I will tell you everything, but you must promise to listen. Not to your lawyers, not to your board, to me. Her hands moved with a pleading that sounded in his chest like a bell. Ethan looked at the envelope that had already been waiting. He felt the weight of choice settle like a small stone in his palm. He signed, slowly, the word he had not spoken aloud in years. Listen. When the waiter, Mark, drew near with a new candle for the table, the shadow at the bar turned and walked out into the rain. The city swallowed him easily. The impartial voice recorded the facts. Grace had arrived, she had mentioned Lagos and a child, someone had watched, and an invisible hand had likely set the stage. The empathetic voice felt the old bandage stir. This was the beginning of something that would ask everything of Ethan, his memory, his power, his willingness to let his silence be answered. The inciting event was not a single loud breaking, it was a careful, precise tapping at the place where his past had been locked. Ethan watched Grace like a man who reads maps for hidden roads. Her hands had closed around the envelope, as if it were something alive. For a while, they simply sat opposite each other and the restaurant carried on, a world of small, predictable transactions. He felt the shape of a conversation forming and kept his hands ready, like a player waiting for the cue. Grace folded her fingers once, then twice, a private counting. She did not speak aloud. She did not need to. Instead, she signed, slowly, each word measured. Ethan read her hands like a compass. I grew up near Lagos, she signed. My name is Grace Carter. I was there when the hospital closed. I knew Sarah. Ethan's chest tightened. He had seen reports years ago, a project in Lagos the company had funded, a clinic that was supposed to be a model of progress. The files had been neat and clinical, full of numbers that made success look tidy. "I know the file," Ethan signed back, fingers stiffer than usual. It was a legal transfer. It was audited. Grace's lips moved, but no sound came. She wrote on the napkin. They'd buried more than debt. She signed after, faster, the motion like a strike. "They took money, Ethan. They closed the doors. Sarah was a child who needed treatment. She died." The empathic part of the narrator felt the room tilt with that sentence. A life condensed into 3 words. Child, needed, died made the air dense. Ethan's hands trembled despite himself. He had made decisions in boardrooms that felt abstract, but the image of a child named Sarah turned statistics into a body. He remembered, fragmentary, a meeting where someone had said collateral damage as though the phrase were an accounting term with no weight. "Who told you?" He signed, fingers asking for names for trails. His eyes sought Grace's face for hints of who had pushed her into this. She looked down at the napkin, then up with a determination that did not seek his pity. "A woman named Miriam," she signed. "She worked at the clinic. She left a note. She came to us in Lagos. They promised help. They took it away." Grace tapped the table where the envelope sat. "This came to me in a box 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to forget, but the letter had your name." Ethan's mind moved to the practical. Who else knew? Who could use this? "Did you come alone?" He signed. Grace's hands stilled. "No," she wrote. "At first they sent men who said they would make it quiet. Then Miriam gave me the letter and told me there was more. She said, 'Find Ethan Pierce.'" Mark, the waiter, refilled Ethan's water with a practiced hand. He watched the 2 of them like someone watching thin ice. "Everything okay?" he asked aloud, and the sound felt clumsy under their small, urgent conversation. Ethan gave Mark a slight shake of the head and mouthed the thanks that Mark did not read. There was an unspoken etiquette. Servers spoke. Ethan listened with his hands. Across the table, Grace's eyes softened a fraction. "I do not want any money," she signed. "I want the truth. I want the names of those who ordered the ledger to close. I want to know who decided." Her fingers formed the words with a precision that made the request a demand and a plea at the same time. Ethan thought of his father, Robert Pierce, and the long patient building of an empire. He thought of the meetings where conversations were trimmed to fit the edges of profit. He remembered the polite conferences where someone would say risk mitigation and the room would nod. His signature had been on documents that made endings neat. He had always told himself that he did not know everything. Responsibility, in his mind, had limits drawn by the pages of reports. But the name Sarah was an intruder, an accusation that could not be papered over. He signed, slow, deliberate. If there was something wrong, it would be investigated. "I will open a review, not with PR, not with lawyers, with facts." Grace's laugh was almost soundless. "You say that she signed, but the facts in Lagos were hidden by our own people. Papers moved, names changed. I have one witness, Miriam. She fears the men who came after her. She is in hiding." Her hand shook on the napkin. "I came because Miriam said someone with your face would listen." Ethan felt a betrayal flicker in him like an electric spark. Not yet a full flame, but enough to raise the hair on his arms. Who had told Miriam to hand a letter to a stranger? Who arranged for a woman to sit opposite him in a city where his comings and goings were tracked? There was a line of thought he had to guard against, the idea that this was a setup. The shadow at the bar from the other night returned as a suspicion, and he did not know if that suspicion was skill or paranoia. He signed a question. Why me? Why not the board? Why not the press? Grace looked at him, eyes clear, and the answer surfaces like a stone in a stream. Because you made the final call in Lagos. Because your signature closed the clinic. Because Miriam said she wanted a person, not an institution. The impartial voice noted the friction. Institutions hide behind forms. People look for faces. Ethan's silence made him both less and more vulnerable. He was a public man who could not be shouted at in the normal way. Words aimed at him had to find his hands. Grace had found that route, and it cut sharper than she or he expected. Their exchange unfurled into more than accusations. They talked of details, dates, names, the way a donation was earmarked and then redirected. Grace described a ledger with lines that did not reconcile. Ethan, who remembered the files as clean, felt the floor shift. There were gaps where his memory had been confident. He found himself trying to reconcile two images of the same event. One in sanitized minutes, the other in Grace's inked napkin notes. Both were compelling, neither could be dismissed. At one point, Ethan signed, "If Miriam is in danger, I will protect her. I have resources." The words landed heavily. Protecting someone meant exposing other people. It meant stepping into a light he had avoided. It meant that his silence, his greatest shield, could no longer be only personal. Responsibility, he realized, was not only in the boardroom. Grace's face folded into a small, private grief. Protection costs more than money, she signed. Miriam has no papers. She cannot disappear into the system. People who helped her have been silenced. She touched the napkin where she had written a phone number and a place, an address in the poorer quarter of the city. This is where Miriam said to wait if she could not leave. She left the note under a stone by a bakery. Ethan read the address, and a memory sparked. A photograph in a file he had once skimmed, a child's face half hidden, eyes like coals. He had never expected those eyes to find a place in his private thoughts. The narrator's empathic voice watched him lean forward. Hands rested on the table like a confession. "I will go," he signed. Grace hesitated. Her fingers faltered and then steadied. "There will be men who watch," she signed. "There will be those who profit from keeping the ledger soft. They will not want you looking where they kept the dirt." The mention of profit and men produced a flash of anger behind Ethan's calm. He had lived by the idea that his decisions followed a rational arc. The idea that greed could be weaponized against truth felt like a betrayal inside the family. He thought of Robert Pierce not only as his father, but as the set of rules he had inherited. The thought of men who acted in his company's name to hide suffering was unbearable. "Who are they?" he signed. Grace's eyes flicked to the entrance as if she had rehearsed the reaction. "I don't know all the names, but there is contact. David Hale. He sits on your board. He was at the meeting when the transfer was finalized." Miriam whispered his name before she left. Grace's fingers closed on the napkin as though she wanted to squeeze the truth into a clearer shape. At the word David Hale, a chill ran through Ethan. David was a longtime board member, a man whose handshake had sealed many deals. The idea that a trusted board member might be tied to a hidden ledger made the story twist. Betrayal, the narrator noted, often lives in familiar clothes. They sat in silence for a moment, hands resting on different edges of a private decision. The empathic voice understood that this was a pivot from cautious curiosity to action. Ethan thought of his mother, of the letter of the child named Sarah, and realized that his life of careful distance had been a choice made to hide from steps like this. Now someone had placed a child in his path and called him to answer. Outside, rain blurred the city into forgiving streaks. Inside, the world had narrowed to two people and a napkin that might hold the map to a hidden room. Ethan pushed the envelope slightly closer, and for the first time since the restaurant chair had received him, he allowed his hands to move with the urgency that matched his pulse. He signed decisively, "Tomorrow. We are going to Lagos." They left the restaurant under rain that felt like a benediction, small drifts that hid footprints. The city exhaled around them. Taxis hissed through puddles. Ethan sat beside Grace in the car. The envelope folded between them like a shared secret. The driver knew only where to go. He did not know what weight the passengers carried. Inside, the narrator who watched closely felt the air in Ethan's chest tighten, as if the city itself had closed a fist. He had expected confrontation with a board, with lawyers, with the clean machinery of corporate apology. He had not expected a handwritten line in his mother's script. He had not expected blood to sing the paper of his memory. They arrived at a small office rented under a nondescript sign in a part of the city that smelled of boiled plantain and diesel. Miriam's address, Grace had said, was a place that hid people the city had chosen to forget. Grace moved with a quiet purpose. Ethan carried with him the careful architecture of a life shaped by other people's decisions. He had always been good at assembling facts. He was less practiced at assembling truth from the soft, ragged edges of human testimony. Grace unlocked a back door and led him up a narrow stair. Light from a small window made slats across the floorboards. The room where they met Miriam was spare: a single bed, a tin kettle, a shelf of secondhand books. Miriam sat near the window, a woman whose hands had known work and whose eyes had known storms. She stared at Ethan with a look that mixed fear and a bravery that had been learned on the road when there was no other teacher. For a moment, the empathic voice wanted only to watch them breathe. Faces in rooms like this hold histories that are not easily summarized. Ethan signed hesitantly Miriam, and the woman nodded once, then twice, a small, quick punctuation of yes. Her hands trembled as she signed back. She did not give news in full sentences. She gave it in the slow cadence of someone measuring whether the floor would hold. Grace set the envelope on the small table between them and slid a photocopy from it. The paper had been handled. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as if it had been folded and refolded while someone tried to iron meaning into it. The photocopy showed a note, neat, looping handwriting, addressed to a man whose name Ethan had seen in the boardroom minutes more times than he had fingers to count: David Hale. The line that made the room tilt was brief and surgical: "Please proceed with closure. We cannot risk further exposure. Margaret Pierce." The impartial voice cataloged the facts: a letter, a signature, a directive. The empathic voice felt the space in Ethan's chest shift, as though a hand had reached in and rearranged some small, crucial organ. Margaret Pierce, his mother, had written a line: "The word proceeds." The word closure. The implication: his mother had chosen to cut aid to the Lagos clinic. She had not been a victim of circumstance alone, she had been an actor. Ethan's hands, which usually translated with calm efficiency, fluttered like a bird surprised at a window. He looked at the photocopy as if the image might peel away and reveal the pages behind it. "My mother signed this," he signed. The movement of his fingers was quick with disbelief. Miriam's hands confirmed the fact in a way that left no room for the kind of denials a lawyer might later attempt. "It is real," she signed. Her fingers pinned the air in a way that made it feel like a wound. She met with David. She said the project was compromising things at home. She said we could not be seen. Miriam's eyes shuddered and opened like something trying to remember how to see without flinching. "They told us the funds would return. They did not." Grace watched Ethan as if measuring the tilt. "I only found this after Miriam left it," she signed. "It was hidden inside a book. Miriam said she had hoped you'd find it. She said she couldn't send it directly. She was afraid." There was an attempt at softness in Grace's hands, but the sentence landed like a bell: fear married to secrecy. For Ethan, the betrayal was a particular kind of poison because it nested where he had kept the most tender parts of himself. Margaret had been the ghost who taught him gentleness through thumbs and lips and the patient schooling of signs. She had been the one who had taught him how to make a voice out of hands, who had shown him the world as a mosaic he could touch. To imagine her choosing silence for others, to order a clinic closed when children needed help, contradicted the memory he had built around her like a chapel. The room held its breath. Outside, someone hammered a tin sign in a nearby shop, the sound bright and ordinary against what had been said. Ethan signed slowly, the way a man might say grace after a confession. Why? Why would she do that? His hands moved with the kind of accusation that could not be said aloud. Miriam's answer was not neat. She signed names and dates, and then, with a gesture of helplessness, tapped the photocopy. She had seen the meeting, she said. She had been in the clinic when Margaret visited. The woman who had once taught Ethan to draw letters in the air had not been the same in that room. She had been pressed. She had been told things that smelled like danger. The empathic narrator listened to the smallness of the tale. Threats as subtle as calls in the night, promises of silence in exchange for safety. They told her the family's reputation would be at risk. Miriam signed. They said, and her hands faltered, they said it was for the greater good. The greater good. The phrase fell like ash. Ethan felt his inheritance transform in his mind from coin to chain. He had imagined his mother's choices as the kind you make to shelter a child, to preserve a family name. He had not imagined them as bargains struck in the margins of suffering. The betrayal cut not only at his memory of her, but at the scaffolding of his identity. Grace's hands moved with an edge of something fierce. There is more, she signed. The documents show transfers to shell accounts. David's signature appears on payments that disappeared into pockets. Miriam could not prove it alone. She tried to tell local journalists. She was silenced. Her fingers were quick now, the way a relay runner snaps the baton. I found a name, Ethan. People on your board. People in the legal counsel. The impartial voice ticked off the implications. If the letter was genuine, then the cover-up had roots deeper than a single callous decision. If Margaret had signed, she had either been coerced, deceived, or complicit. Each option rewired what Ethan believed about his family. Trust, which had once been a bedrock, now trembled. Ethan felt something like a child's rage flare. Less about public scorn than about betrayal from the person who had taught him how to be human. Did she know Sarah? He signed, fingers sharp. Miriam's hands closed, then opened. We were told that the clinic's data would be protected, that patients would be moved. They said they would continue support in another place, but nothing moved. Sarah was left. The empathic narrator watched Ethan's face change, from curiosity to disbelief to a hardness that was new and terrible. He had been shielded by silence for years. That silence had been, in part, a protection his mother had given him by choosing the family's safety over the messy work of reckoning with the world. Now, he had to decide whether to stand inside that shelter or to step out and face the storm. The first betrayal had been the closure. The second, larger betrayal revealed itself as a mirror. The people who had promised to hold the family's name had traded a child's life for their comfort. David Hale's name, once a simple grid on a meeting agenda, now looked like a stain that would not come out. Ethan's hands clenched into a fist and then smoothed. He was a man of numbers, trained to transform chaos into ledger lines. This was not a problem to be solved with models alone. Faces lived in the margins of spreadsheets. Miriam, Sarah, Margaret. Each required more than a calculation. They required answers. He signed, finally, a decision that sounded in the room like a small, sharp vowel. We find the truth. We found the people who knew. We found David. The empathic narrator felt the echo of that vow in the way Miriam's shoulders eased and in the steadiness that came into Grace's fingers. Around them, the city continued its ordinary work of light and rain. Inside, a man's inheritance lay unmade, and he would have to pick up every splinter to see what had been hidden beneath. They left the spare room with the taste of photocopied paper and old tea in their mouths. The street smelled of diesel and fried plantain, and the city folded itself around them like a place that had long learned to keep secrets. Ethan felt the buildings press in. Every window might be watching. The vow he had signed across the small table hung heavy in his hands like a key he could not yet turn. The first problem arrived as paperwork. Back in his office the next morning, the board calendar looked like a map of obligations that had been planned years in advance. Meetings, calls, filings, his name on 100 faceless agendas. Ethan had believed that he could set aside the two lives, the life of the company and the life of the man, into two neat boxes. Grace and Miriam had shown him those boxes were porous. The ledger leaked. He could feel the weight of consequence crawl up the back of his neck. If he pursued this openly, the company would be forced into a public inquiry. Investors would panic. Stock would wobble. People he had trusted without question might be exposed. If he contained it, he would live with the lie. Both options hurt different parts of him. One would hurt strangers, the other would hurt his sense of integrity. The empathic voice noticed how his hands trembled when he signed alone in his office. He used his fingers to pace arguments the way other men paced rooms. Public, he signed into an empty space, as if testing how the word felt when it had to be spelled without sound. The silence in the room answered him with its flat, honest emptiness. Silence had been a companion. Now it felt like a witness. Grace moved like a person with a plan she had not yet allowed anyone to see. She worked through channels that did not demand headlines. She made calls to people who still remembered Miriam's name in Lagos. She met with a journalist who agreed to listen under strict conditions. She arranged discreet security. The more careful she became, the more she seemed to be threading a thin rope through a storm. Ethan found himself pulled into the office by a dozen hands. His legal counsel recommended a measured path, internal review, selective disclosures, legal containment. We can control the narrative, his counsel said in a voice that smoothed edges like polish. He watched their lips form words he could not return with tone. He signed questions to Grace in the hallway, swift, short. Who can we trust? How long until the story leaks? Her hands gave him answers in small, steadier shapes, but trust felt brittle. Someone, the shadow at the bar or someone else, had known enough to plant Miriam with a photocopy. Someone had wanted something to shift. The idea that their adversary might manipulate the revelation for their own gain gnawed at his decisions. He could not be sure whether he was dismantling an injustice or stepping into a trap. The doubt burned like cold. The external pressure rose when an anonymous email arrived at Ethan's office. It was short and clinical. We know what you are doing. Stop. There was a file attached, a blurred photograph of Miriam standing outside the tiny bakery where she left the note. The message had no name, no sender, only a timing that read like a threat. They watched. They would act if he did not desist. The empathic narrator felt Ethan's world contract. He had always measured danger by contracts and numbers. This was the first danger that smelled of human hands. The mother he remembered, Margaret, had been a protector. Now the specter of her decision complicated the picture. Had she been coerced the way Miriam suggested? Or had she chosen the family's preservation over a stranger's child? Either way, the blow landed on the softest part of him, memory. Inside the company, subtle shifts began. David Hale called with a charm that was threaded through with something colder. Ethan, we should proceed cautiously, he said, voice smooth, as if discussing weather. Ethan watched his fingers form the sign for caution against his chest, a private motion. He suspected David's polite caution mass calculation. The board itself became a place of static smiles and unreadable eyes. Allies rearranged themselves like chess pieces. Ethan's internal dilemma deepened when old friends came with offers of help that tasted like hedging bets. Let me meditate. One said, we can broker a deal with Miriam in private. The offer felt like an attempt to paper over blood with currency. Ethan felt anger spike at the board that would soothe him with a bomb, which was not an apology, at himself for being trained to accept such bombs. He wanted truth, not transaction. Miriam's fear turned physical. She grew jumpy at night, checked doors twice, changed where she slept. She whispered into Grace's palm about men who came to her street and asked for her by description. The empathic voice watched how fear can fracture resolve. Miriam insisted she stay hidden until they had proof. Grace wanted to move fast. Ethan wanted to move decisively. Each impulse pulled at the seam of their alliance. Then, the first real rupture. A well-placed tabloid in the morning printed a story about Ethan Pierce's charitable missteps without naming the Lagos clinic. The story used old press releases and anonymous sources to suggest mismanagement at philanthropic arms. The implication was subtle: donate more to save face. The timing was surgical. Ethan recognized the pattern of deflection. The paper had been bait, either to ransom his attention or to muddy the waters. It succeeded in making the company defensive and made his private vow public through consequence rather than confessional. The board wanted damage control. Lawyers drafted statements. PR executives rehearsed tones that would protect value. Ethan's silence became a liability, translated by others into a vacuum filled with promises he had not made. He signed across a closed office door. We will not let them bury Sarah again, and the hollow room receive his oath. That night, as rain again stitched the windows, Miriam's hiding place was breached, not violently, nothing brutal enough to be loud, but with the terror of an unseen hand. Her kettle was missing from the shelf. A photograph she had kept of Sarah was gone from under a loose floorboard. The notebook where she had recorded names and dates had been rifled through. Someone had been intimate with her life and taken what mattered most. The passive threat became active theft. Grace found Miriam shaken and on the verge of collapse, and the empathic voice felt the smallness of their humanity against the machinery they faced. Ethan arrived and, without words, signed into a small pool of light. We move now. He had weighed the cost and chosen the risk. The decision peeled the last of his careful cover away. He realized that protecting Miriam meant exposing himself. It meant possibly losing the company he had been taught to defend. It meant naming his mother's signature and letting it be judged. As they laid plans to travel to Lagos with a small, discreet team, a new message came through. It was not a threat, but an image. A childhood photograph of Ethan with his mother, both smiling in a garden, and beneath it, a single line in neat type. Some families keep secrets to survive. Remember that. The empathy-clipped narrator recognized how the message aimed not only at his power, but at his softest memory. The tension had escalated from a quiet revelation at a restaurant to a resonant, dangerous pursuit. Ethan's internal dilemma, preserve the family and the company or allow truth to fracture them, had become a public calculation. Men in suits plotted in rooms with thick glass. Miriam trembled in a borrowed flat. Grace watched the door with a patience that had become fierce. The city around them hummed, unaware of the small acts of courage being arranged. At the edge of sleep that night, Ethan's hands signed into the dark the name of the woman who had once taught him to speak with his palms. Mother. The word landed like a stone. He did not yet know whether Margaret's signature on the photocopy was the active betrayal of a will or the coerced mark of fear. He only knew that everything he had built now balanced on the question, and when the morning came, they would fly into a place where the truth might be harder or easier than they expected. They found the clinic at dusk, a long, low building with flaking blue paint and windows like tired eyes. The air smelled of dust and cooking oil, and a fan turned lazily above a dozen empty beds. Lamps, once bright to chase away fear, were dim now. The place held the echo of small things: a child's shoe, a bottle with a faded label, a poster on the wall that promised care and hope. Ethan felt each of those echoes like a weight in his palms. The room where the confrontation would happen was the old records office, a space full of metal cabinets and the fossil smell of paper. Grace had arranged for a small, local journalist to bring witnesses. Miriam came in on legs that trembled but held. Ethan watched her sit and fold her hands hard in her lap. His chest felt hollow and full at the same time, as if grief and duty were pulling against the same bone. The impartial voice notes the scene. Men in suits from the company had arrived, quietly behind them, and among them walked Michael Hart, Ethan's COO, the man who had signed off thousands of decisions with a casual calm that had always comforted Ethan. Michael's presence made the room colder because Ethan had not expected him. Trust, once placed, casts long shadows when it falls. Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. He set the photocopy, the letter with Margaret Pierce's signature, on the table and pushed it toward Michael with firm, careful fingers. The movement was like placing a charge. Michael's jaw tightened for breath. He had always been the one to say, "We will handle this," in a voice designed to smooth the alarm. Tonight his hands trembled. David Hale arrived later, escorted by his own quiet smile, as if he had been invited to adjudicate an argument rather than be the center of it. He looked at Ethan with an old certainty that cold politeness people use when they believe laws bend for them. He took a seat in slow motion and crossed one leg over the other. Ethan signed a single question, his hands chopping the air like a blade. "Did you order the closure?" The room listened in the kind of silence that drapes itself over people before a verdict. Even the fan seemed to hush. David smiled and spoke aloud, his voice smooth. We considered many options, he said. It was not a single man. It was a consensus. He used the word consensus like a shield. The journalist scribbled. Miriam watched with empty, fierce eyes. Ethan watched David's mouth shape the sentences and measured how the public tone fell against the private hand signs. He signed quickly, the motion jagged. Who profited? Who moved money? His hands asked for names. His silence demanded truth. David's smile thinned. He leaned forward, and for a moment his face was just a plain thing under the light. There were transfers, he admitted, and the room slanted with the admission, but the money went to what we thought were legitimate partners. Some payments were redirected. If there was wrongdoing, it was hidden from many of us. Grace's fingers moved so fast they trembled. She pushed a file toward Miriam and Ethan, bank records, excerpts she had coaxed out of an accountant who feared for his safety. The numbers were messy, the kind of ledger that hides in neat columns until someone with a steady eye points at the shadow. The traces led, improbably, to an offshore account with payments that had a routing signature. Michael Hart's personal consultant's firm. The empathic voice felt the room tilt like a ship taking a wave. Michael's face, which had been calm, flushed. He stood as if to deny, then sat as if denial might sound bad in front of witnesses he could not control. Ethan watched Michael and did something he had not planned. He unfurled his hands and signed the single word, "Why?" Michael's hands were not quick. He searched the air for words and found only a thin apology. "We rerouted funds to manage risks," he said aloud. The consultants promised a plan to relocate services. It required discretion. His eyes did not meet Miriam's. "I thought it was practical." Miriam's hand reached toward Ethan and then back like lightning. She signed to him one trembling line. "They told us it was for protection. They came and promised returns. They left us with nothing." Her fingers folded like someone closing a book forever. Then the room broke open. David, who had been measured, snapped with a small, sharp cruelty. "Do not paint all of us as villains," he said. Margaret felt the pressure. She signed because she believed it would keep the family safe. She believed me. He said the name like a benediction. "I protected the family when she was frightened. I did what I thought best for the company." Ethan's heart became a stone. The empathic narrator wanted to hold the motion in place. A mother frightened, a company deciding, a man in a suit choosing. But the impartial notes the next fact. The ledger showed payments to a shell company that Michael had recommended years ago and that David had used for consulting. The trace was not accidental. Ethan signed, slowly and then faster. "Did you threaten her? Who threatened my family?" The question was raw, dug from his ribs. David's mouth flattened. He did not answer directly. But in the small, electric pause, the journalist's camera flashed, and the silence between words grew heavy with meaning. Michael finally broke. He reached for his phone and, with shaking fingers, opened a series of messages that Eli, the journalist, demanded to see. The messages were public now. Threats from an unknown number to Margaret's private line. Someone had said that if the Pierce family made noise about certain matters, shame would follow. And those messages had a number traceable to a phone associated with a shell company tied to David's network. "That's not proof of me," David snapped aloud, but his voice had lost its sharpened edge. He looked older in that instant, like a man surprised by the ugliness of his own reflection. The room smelled suddenly of dust and human breath. The real betrayal unfolded like a slow reveal. Michael had accepted payments to channel funds into consultant accounts. David had used those accounts to pay intermediaries to intimidate and to cover tracks. Margaret, vulnerable and afraid for her family's safety, perhaps for reasons David had invoked, perhaps because of threats she received, had signed to close a clinic believing it was a necessary sacrifice. Then, when guilt could no longer be contained, she had written a letter in secret, hoping someone with Ethan's face would find it. Miriam had hidden the letter because she had loved the clinic and because she had hoped a man with a different kind of power would listen. All of it was ugly and human at once. Betrayals had been committed in suit-lined rooms, in whispered threats, in choices that thought they were protecting something while destroying something else. Ethan watched David, Michael, Miriam, and Grace like someone watching different rotations of the same wheel. He felt his silence sharpen into an instrument. He folded his hands and signed with absolute clarity, "Confess. Tell the truth now. I will let the court hear it." The quiet in the room took on the tone of a held breath, waiting for a collapse. Michael's shoulders sagged. He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope and slid it across the table. He looked at Ethan with an honest, broken face. "I took payments," he said, voice small. "I thought if I managed it, we could keep the company intact and avert chaos. I was wrong. I never meant for Sarah to die." David's face crumpled in a different way, less of a plea than a small rationalization. "We thought the clinic could be relocated. We thought the funds would be used to build a better facility elsewhere. We were playing a long game. We failed to see the human cost." The journalist recorded every word. Miriam sobbed quietly into her hands. Grace watched Ethan as if seeing him for the first time, not as a powerful man who signs words, but as a human being who could hold rage and mercy in the same palm. Ethan felt something break and something open. There was a choice in that fracture: fold the family in and cover the wrongdoing, or let the truth stand and let consequences fall where they must. He had cultivated silence as safety. Now that silence could be an instrument for truth. He signed his decision with hands that did not tremble. "We will bring this into the light. We will name the accounts. We will speak Miriam's name. We will speak Sarah's name. We will open records. I will step down from decision-making that hid this." The words were promises, and their weight settled on the shoulders in the room like a new, shared burden. Outside, thunder moved beyond the city's lights, a distant drum. Inside, people reached for phones, for papers, for the instruments of accountability. David tried to smooth the edges with new sentences, but the atmosphere had shifted. Men who had believed they were invulnerable felt small and fragile. The empathic narrator watched Ethan stand at the window after the confessions, his palms reflecting the streetlights like two bright plates. He could have signed a different life into being, one of retreat, of rearmor. Instead, he walked into a small press area the company had prepared, and with the help of an interpreter, he let his hands speak to a wider world. The image was simple and fierce: a man who had been silent by nature, using his hands as a witness. Cameras flashed, words were translated to ears and to print. He told the basic truth: mistakes were made, people had been harmed, and the company would change. He named Miriam's courage and Sarah's memory. He promised accountability. There was no easy absolution. There was only the work that followed: investigations, resignations, and the slow, patient return of small things, like a clinic that would be rebuilt and a community that would see the proof of action. The climax left open the moral ledger, consequences for the betrayed and for the betrayers, but also space for redemption if that redemption was earned. In the hush after the cameras left, Ethan returned to Miriam and Grace. He took Miriam's hand, a simple human clasp, and signed, "Thank you. I'm sorry." The words had no sound but had a weight that all in the room felt. Grace touched his shoulder like a promise. The impartial voice would record outcomes. Legal cases would follow, resignations would be tendered, funds would be traced. The empathic voice held the deeper turn. A man who had once lived inside silence chose, at last, to make his hands the way the world knew him, not to hide behind what would protect a name, but to hold open the story that must be told. The moral was not tidy. It asked more than it answered. But for once the city felt like it might hold the weight of truth and let healing begin. They rebuilt in small, careful steps. The clinic's new roof went up in bright sheets that caught the sun like promises. Volunteers painted the walls a hopeful white. A water pump was installed where once there had been only a rusting tap. The town came when invited, and inch by inch, the place began to smell less of dust and more of fresh paint and cooking fires. The children ran in the courtyard with a freedom that felt like a quiet answer. The impartial voice notes the practical sequence: legal inquiries opened, bank accounts frozen, and audits that stretched like threads until they reached the offshore nests. David Hale and Michael Hart faced internal review. External prosecutors followed when evidence proved robust. Resignations were tendered, settlements negotiated, and a board reshuffle made room for people who had not learned to bend ethics into spreadsheets. The company's stock dipped and then steadied as transparency replaced secrecy. The public watched, judged, and in small ways demanded better. But facts alone do not stitch wounds. Human work did. Ethan created a fund in Sarah's name and underwrote the clinic's reconstruction. He insisted the governance include community members and Miriam as a trustee. He pushed for full employee protections and whistleblower safeguards in his company's policies. The gesture had dollars behind it, but it also carried another currency he had not used until then: accountability. Grace stayed in Lagos for months. She taught local volunteers basic records management, helped set up a small legal aid desk for the community, and sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, sat with Miriam and went through notebooks and leads that could not be lost. Miriam's face softened in ways that were not immediate, but that grew like new green on old stems. She began to speak on radio programs, not for attention, but to teach others how to hold a story and not be crushed by it. She kept a photograph of Sarah on her shelf, and on some mornings, read the girl's name aloud into a room that listened. Ethan returned to a life that looked similar on the surface, but had been cleaved by truth. He did step down from the decisions that had been made behind closed doors. He also stayed to oversee reforms he had promised. People asked him whether he had lost everything by telling the truth. He signed small answers and sometimes spoke through an interpreter. The public learned to watch his hands as they shaped meaning in the air. In private rooms, he began to ask questions with his hands that had the force of law. The empathic voice remembers the nights when he could not sleep, when his hands would form the old shapes and find nothing to answer. The hardest work was not the legal fallout. It was the personal reckoning with his mother's mark upon the paper. He visited Margaret's grave more than once. He sat with the photocopy in his lap and traced the signature as if it were a map he could read. He thought of the woman who had taught him language by tracing letters into his palm and who had signed, in a different kind of pressure, a decision that had cost a child her future. Learning the full story was a jagged kindness. Margaret had been frightened. There were recordings of phone calls, not of her words but of the tone of coercion, and testimony that suggested David's network had quietly bullied and threatened, invoking reputational ruin and implied harm to the family. It did not erase Margaret's signature, it complicated it. Ethan sat with that complication, the way a man sits with a wound that will leave a scar. He could clean it and stitch it, but the mark remained. One afternoon, in a small garden behind the new clinic, Ethan signed to Grace a question that had been folding inside him for months. "How do you forgive?" Grace looked at him with an intimacy that had been earned in the storm. She signed back slowly, the same way she spoke to trembling witnesses. "Forgiveness is not a single moment," she signed. "It is a choice you make again, and then again, until the pieces become lighter." Ethan considered that. Forgiveness for him did not mean forgetting. It did not mean excuses. It meant naming clearly what had been done, allowing consequences, and then deciding whether to carry the weight or lay it down. He chose to hold that weight and to turn it into a structure that could hold others: funds, policies, community voices, a public record. He stepped into the moral labor of repair rather than into the refuge of denial. The town gave Sarah a small memorial, a tree planted near the clinic with a plaque in her name. Miriam placed a painted shoe beneath the sapling, a child's shoe the size of a long, bright absence. Ethan stood there, hands folded like palms closed over a small thing, and signed the name Sarah into the air. The movement felt like a benediction and like a confession at once. People around him, who had not known him before as anything but a name in the news, learned to see the man who had been silent and who had chosen to speak in action. There were moments of rawness. Members of the Pierce family wanted privacy, and some could not accept the public unraveling of decisions. There were whispers that anything could be bought back, that reputations could be smoothed. The empathic voice felt those moments as remnants of old machinery trying to restart. But the new rules, The leaks sealed, the funds traced, the survivors compensated, made simple smoothing impossible. The world had changed where it mattered. In quieter hours, Ethan taught sign language classes at the clinic. He sat among people who had lived without speech for a variety of reasons and learned from their humor and their grief. Children learned his hands like a new kind of light. Sometimes they would clap and make a sound he could not make, and he would laugh with them. Those small shared noises were repaired in miniature, the sound of a hand meeting a hand and finding an echo. At night, when the city lights washed the windows, Ethan sometimes signed into the dark the simple inventory of things he had learned. Truth hurts, power tempts, silence protects and isolates. He had once thought silence itself neutral. Now he knew silence could be an ally of wrong as well as a shield for good. Power, he discovered, demanded active care. Responsibility, it turned out, was not a ledger entry, but a constant work of attention. The impartial voice records that the company's reforms held long enough for auditors and regulators to close cases with sanctions and oversight. The clinic operated under new governance and saw patients who had once been turned away. Miriam became a local organizer and received recognition from groups who worked with survivors. Grace returned sometimes to the city to assist with broader reforms and to the clinic to sit by Miriam's side. She and Ethan did not fall into romance as a tidy end. Their bond was quieter, a mutual recognition that lives can be changed by bearing witness. The last image stays with a smallness that feels like truth. On a late afternoon, Ethan sat on the clinic steps. A little boy chased a paper boat in a puddle and laughed. Ethan smiled, his hands idle on his knees, and then reached down to scoop up the boat. He signed to the child, offering a clumsy lesson on how to make another boat. The boy watched, eyes bright, and copied the motion with fingers too small to be precise. For a moment, their hands met in the same language. The empathic voice held that scene as proof that repair is possible in small gestures. The moral reflection is not neat. There will be no single absolution written at the end. The story asks more of us. To look at where our safety begins and another suffering starts, to name the bargains we make in the shadows, and to decide whether we will be the people who cover or the people who uncover. Ethan, who had lived a life of ordered silence, found that speaking, in policy, in confession, in the simple work of rebuilding, was the way he could live honestly with the past. He still carries his mother's signature as a map of what had been done and what must be undone. He still learns how to forgive himself for the part silence played. He still signs to himself sometimes in empty rooms, "I will hold them." And the hands that once learned to shelter are now hands that build. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.